Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to 50 Years of Spartans and Beyond. I'm John Schwartz, and joining me today is Andy Wasynczuk. Andy has had an outstanding athletic career at Case Western Reserve, but then he carried that on to a career in athletics outside of that, where he spent a lot of time working with the New England Patriots, managing the stadium construction, and really excited to hear from him about that today. Andy, thank you for joining us.
It's good to join you, John. Thank you.
If you can start off, and I always find this interesting, how people found their way to Case Western Reserve, because everyone has a little bit of a different story. Do you remember how you ended up here and chose Case Western Reserve as your school?
Well, I grew up in Chicago and, pretty much had in mind trying to stay, somewhat in a, 5-6 hour circle. And so the schools I was looking at were maybe Northwestern, WashU down in St. Louis, and Case. And I remember my high school had what they called like a resource center that had all the college catalogs from around the country. It was like a large office space, but it was maybe totally nerdy of me, but I loved going through and just it was almost like Christmas shopping, reading the courses that different schools had. And when I would read through what Case had to offer in the engineering and math spaces, which was kind of what my interest and passion was, I always thought, these were, cool, awesome. And obviously some campus visits, turned into some, greater level of interest. Back then, Case had a kind of a competitive test as well that everybody was invited to take to try to get a full scholarship. It was called a Smith Scholarship, and so that was a pretty big influence on me in my decision making, because I was fortunate enough to have landed one of those. So that made the decision financially a lot easier to swallow as well.
For sure. Now, you came here and you were a javelin thrower on the track and field team. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found your way to that? And then also, I'm sure, and everyone we've spoken to who played for him has a Coach Sudak story. And if you can, tell us how you ended up on the team and then your experience with Coach Sudak.
Yeah, it was, maybe a little bit of a kind of a crazy, circuitous route to have ended up on the team. I had actually, when I came to Case, my sport was soccer. I hadn't played a ton of soccer in high school. I had grown up going to something called Ukrainian school. My parents were immigrants, first generation. And so my Saturdays and Friday nights were tied up with that kind of stuff until I finished my junior year of high school. So it was senior year that I was able to actually, join athletics. And at that time, being kind of a walk-on onto the soccer team, I still managed to play varsity soccer from my high school. And that translated well to, when I joined up at Case, as a freshman, I still, managed to get a starting role at left wing. But I wasn't that good. I recognize that. And one of the interesting dynamics of a freshman year was, also joining a fraternity. I joined SAE, and we were always big into intramural sports. And the spring intramural sports, one of the big contests was around track and field events against other fraternities and other, kind of organized teams. And I had reluctantly agreed with some of my, more senior fraternity brothers to run the quarter mile, which I wasn't bad at given all the running we do in soccer. But it's just a miserable race for me because I know I'm running, to a point of where I'm near throwing up or passing out at the end of it. And I convinced one of the guys that was kind of organizing our team to also let me try javelin throwing. He was actually on the varsity team as a javelin thrower. He was a football player as well. And so he kind of gave me some tips and how to do it. And by the time things were settled, I actually, did almost, die on the quarter mile, but thankfully I had, pulled it out and got our team a win on that one. But I was way more comfortable, getting out into the field and with my fraternity brothers coaching, got like third place in intramurals on the javelin throw. Well, Coach Sudek was out and about, always kind of scouting. He and his, typical gruff voice was like, "Hey, Wasynczuk, you got to come out, tomorrow, see you on that quarter-mile track. I want to get you some work on that." And I was like, "Coach, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in quarter miling. If you wanted me to throw javelin, I might actually be interested in doing that." And he kind of said, "Well, we'll get you to do both." I think I'm one of the only people that ever actually managed to consistently say no to him about the quarter-mile piece, because I think so many other people eventually relent. But he did let me, go ahead and focus on the jav. And it was good because by the following year, we had recruited all sorts of great soccer stars. So I was deep onto the roster, deep way down low on the roster for the soccer team. So I actually, pivoted and decided, okay, let me, put all my effort into the javelin. And it played out pretty well. By, the end of that sophomore year, I was number one on the team, varsity team. And, in all the meets that we had for the next 3 years, I don't think I finished any worse than third. And junior, senior year, senior year was a disappointment because I won all the dual meets, but in the conference championships, there was an upstart that actually was a phenom in high school, but didn't do well in our matchup in the dual meet. But he uncorked a 225-yard throw in the conference championship, and that was way better than I'd ever done in my career. So I finished a lowly second on that one in the conference.
If you can, we'll switch to the academics here for a second. You got your bachelor's degree and your master's degree in engineering. How did that help in your career going forward? And how did that help shape the direction of your path going forward?
Well, it was interesting because basically, Case had this 5-year bachelor's master's program, and I was fortunate enough again to come in with some advanced placement. And with my full ride scholarship, I thought it really makes sense for me to be at Case all 4 years. I probably could have graduated in 3, but that's what kind of jumped me into doing the master's degree as well, because I did both of those in the 4 years that I had there at Case. But I loved technology, and it was one of those things that the decision-making process by the time I finished my Case career was, do I want to be on the pure technical end as a designer, or do I want to maybe shift into the business side of technology? For me, honestly, it felt through my experience with my SAE fraternity brothers that I started realizing I enjoyed the people process at least as much as some of the kind of the idea things that we dealt with in the classroom setting. So I had already decided by the time I was graduating Case, I wanted to go back to business school as well. And as a byproduct of that, my dream was to eventually try to run a high-tech, company. That was my thought process. That would probably take me a number of years to get through. But I spent my first couple of years after Case at Hewlett Packard in a kind of a technical marketing role, and that was a nice kind of mix of both technology and business. It was really helpful for me before starting 2 years after the Case graduation at Harvard at the business school. So we did a lot of things at HP that gave me at least some sense of how business works, what you try to do with customers, what you need to do internally by way of technology and suppliers and things like that. So it was a really helpful kind of foundation that between Case, HP to launch into the business side of things that had a lot to do with technology.
Do you mind kind of going off script here for a second? Can you talk a little bit about what HP was like back then? Because I have to imagine that company has changed a lot as the uses of computers have changed, a lot over the years.
Well, interestingly enough, it was not a computer company when I was there. It was an instrument company, and by that, test equipment for the telecommunication space, test equipment for military in terms of radar systems and the like. So My job was at Stanford Park Division, which basically focused on microwave test equipment, and we had for the most part signal generators that were very, very pure. And so these signal generators, in order to test different modulators, different things that were used in both radar and telecom, you needed kind of these precise pieces of equipment. But that's where HP had been founded, and it had been extremely successful in that space. And it was right around the time that I was there that they started to dabble in a few other areas, like maybe kind of more sophisticated programmable fancy desktop calculators that eventually turned into desktop computers. They had some divisions that were focusing on developing printing technology. So HP printers were just getting started back then. So very different company.
Wow. You eventually make the jump, you talk about going to the business world, but you eventually make the jump from the business world to a little bit of a different business world. And that's when you met the Kraft family. Can you talk about how you got involved with them and what that led to?
Yeah, so I've talked in other ways about kind of the crazy circuitous and maybe just darn lucky kind of things that happen in life to put you in a particular place. My job out of business school, first iteration was with AT&T. I spent maybe 3 years there, but for all sorts of reasons, decided to chase an opportunity with Bain & Company, a consulting firm. And while at Bain and having some, good fortune with some of the, client projects that I was working on, had gotten a little bit of I guess a reputation around certain kinds of opportunities that, maybe our sister organization at Bain Consulting was called Bain Capital. They ultimately, would hire Bain consulting teams from time to time to, try to make something, that they purchased at a relatively low level, much more valuable, and they could, ideally, sell that or spin it off, 3 to 5 years later. One of the projects I was involved with, 18 months later, they had were able to generate an incredible return. And this was kind of in combination with having a young associate that, happened to be in my, office space area. We shared offices. There were 8 of us in this, relatively small area. And the associate that I'm about to refer to, I heard him talking about tennis from time to time. We decided that it'd be fun after work sometime to get together, hit the ball around. When I'm thinking to identify what maybe high school court or community courts might be in the area near our offices, he said, "Well, why don't we just go to my family's house?" And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And they have tennis courts at their home. I wasn't used to that growing up, but went out to this beautiful estate in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is a community just outside Boston. And, it was a phenomenal property, and they had a gorgeous, a pristine tennis court that we proceeded for the next 45 minutes to play on. And as we were kind of coming to the end of an hour, I saw some older gentleman coming by with looked like a couple 6-packs of beer in his hands. And I kind of, cocked my head, and, my friend said, "Oh yeah, my father wanted to meet you because he was one of the early investors in Bain Capital and had heard about, your work on the project that kind of turned into a pretty, good moneymaker for Bain Capital and for him as an investor." Well, the guy I was playing tennis with was Jonathan Kraft. The older gentleman was Robert Kraft. And it was, again, one of those things that, I couldn't have, pulled it off by design if I was, trying to, but all these different, kind of random events pulled together. And we actually spent the next, 45 minutes to an hour shooting the breeze, having a few beers, but shooting the breeze about, what the business of sports might be like. And they had confided that they were, interested in someday owning one of the Boston franchises. They hadn't, committed themselves to one in particular, at least not in the way they were talking about it to me. But on the other hand, the conversation was different than, what kind of, draft do you want to do? It wasn't about, the football team or a baseball team. It was more specifically around, how does a business work in this space? And, from my perspective, it was more, again, of an adventure than it was, as it turned out, in some sense, a job interview, which, I learned, months later when I had the invitation from Robert Kraft to join them in their little, kind of adventure here. It wasn't until years later that I started to put two and two together about how we actually got put together.
Can you share some insights with in terms of the purchase of the Patriots eventually? That for those out there listening who may not know, that is the team that the Krafts eventually purchased and gone on to tremendous success. Can you share some insights into that purchase process?
It was fascinating in the sense that when I got the call from Robert, it was probably 6 months after that first meeting, and it was an invitation from him to join the family in what he now felt was his goal to purchase the Patriots. As opposed to in our earlier meetings, there was some open-endedness about where their efforts might ultimately go. Now it was very specific around the Patriots. And the news that he was sharing with me at that during that invitation was that he had just purchased, along with a real estate partner, the stadium that the Patriots had played in, was at that time called Sullivan Stadium, up in a town 25 miles southwest of Boston in a community called Foxborough. And they purchased that out of bankruptcy, roughly $25 million. And one of my first, I guess, questions was, why would you want to buy that building? I mean, if you're trying to get to the Patriots, that's understandable. But to buy the Sullivan Stadium that was in bankruptcy, it was easily the worst stadium in the NFL. It had a terrible reputation based on the facilities that were there, based on infrastructure. Its capacity was low. So I just was, kind of confused as to why this very smart businessman was doing it. And that's what, allowed him to kind of explain a little bit of the backstory that the stadium itself, as an asset, was not that valuable. But what was valuable that he purchased it, through the bankruptcy process was the lease that existed between the stadium and the team. That included something called an operating covenant. And that operating covenant basically forced it, and I won't go into all the law and because there was a lot of legal, kind of interpretation necessary about why courts would actually physically stop this team from moving out of that stadium when there were already examples around the country of teams leaving in the middle of the night to break leases and then worrying about the damages that might need to be paid. What Kraft was articulating was that there was an area of law tied to this operating covenant which would not allow the team to move, and a court would come in and be able to stop that. So he felt it was going to give him significant leverage to now be able to position himself to be the purchaser of the team. When I got further backstory of, well, if that's so valuable, why didn't other people come in or pay for the building the same way? He shared with me something that he hadn't shared 6 months earlier, that they had actually done a creative bit of work a few years earlier on the land that surrounded the stadium. The land was owned by some radio personalities, sports personalities, did a talk show. But it was for them an opportunity to maybe reopen an old harness racing track, a horse racing track that existed on those 300 acres. But they could never make it go. And, the only revenue that they were generating from all that land and in order to pay the interest that they owed the banks was the parking tied to Patriots games. And so they tried to make it go, but they were, in a position where they were about to themselves see the loan go into foreclosure and lose the property. Kraft struck a deal with them, and it was basically an option to purchase the land, reasonably attractive price for them. But that option, to purchase the land, he said, I'll pay you basically what you need to cover debt service for the year. So as a byproduct, for very short money, he now had a stranglehold on the stadium, because if he chose to buy the land and took away the parking, the stadium couldn't operate. There was no way that you could bring 60,000 fans to that place without, having appropriate parking. And that gave him the heads up, or the leg up, to be able to, single-handedly, come in and attractively buy the stadium out of bankruptcy. And it's the same logic that he was using as why he's going to be able to box out potential buyers of the team. Hopefully within the next year or two, he'd be able to kind of, see that transition take place. So it was blowing my mind in terms of the sophistication of him as a negotiator, and the thoughtfulness and the strategies involved. So I thought, I don't know how successful we're going to be in this endeavor to ultimately secure the team, but I was in, with the idea that I could sure learn a lot from this very savvy business person.
That's an amazing story, because you talk about people seeing the full chessboard. I mean, that's like seeing 7 chessboards at once. And that's really incredible that you think about purchasing that kind of useless piece of land and turning into eventually a team. I'm curious, Andy, at that point, was purchasing an NFL team something that was considered profitable, or was it strictly just a labor of love to buy, a team at that point, to be an owner of an NFL franchise?
I think, from Robert Kraft's perspective, he oftentimes referred to, this dream. If we kind of think about the business of the team, he saw it as a 3-legged stool, and he wanted to kind of work diligently on all 3 of those legs. One was the on-field product. So he had, with his boys, had gone as a season ticket holder to Patriot games. So then he loved what was happening, or what could happen on the football field. And he just, felt that, whatever, business savvy he could bring to how to put together a competitive football team would be, a labor of love in that sense. He first and foremost is a businessman too. So he also, knew that whatever he did in that regard, he would also want to make sure that it was sustainable and profitable for him as a business. And then the third leg was actually something that was, fairly compelling, and that's the ability to use an asset like a, professional sports franchise to, in some way, serve or shape the community. He'd always been very involved in philanthropic causes, and, one of his passions and what he saw, as he went to games with his sons, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people with different economic backgrounds, people that, had different political viewpoints, all sorts of different people, but they'd be hugging each other when great plays would be happening. And, he kind of thought that there's a unique opportunity with a sports franchise to be able to do something of that ilk for the community as well. So it's probably, more expressive to your question of, did he have specific ideas of business? I think he looked at this as a very, very kind of comprehensive asset.
Yeah. If you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you had in building and then, managing and building, Gillette Stadium and putting that up, I imagine involves a lot of the same pieces of land that you were just talking about. But what were some of the challenges and
Well, the first challenge, quite honestly, was, actually even getting to the team, because recall, we started with the stadium when I joined, and, the thought process was, we would likely be able to, make a move on the team within a couple of years. It was owned not by the original founder of the team at that point in time, but rather by a gentleman by the name of Victor Kayam, who bought it with a lot of debt. He made his money with a razor company or a shaving company called Remington, and spent a lot of time on TV promoting the product, as he liked the company liked the product so much that he bought the company. And yet he was not able to, be at all financially, running the football team and the salaries that players were earning and things like that, he was always in trouble, financially, and it manifested itself by him underinvesting in new player contracts, underinvesting in coaching, and so the team was, during that era of the early 90s, if they won 2 or 3 games in a given season, that was a good year for them. As a byproduct, the fans were not necessarily showing up at the stadium. We played in front of half-empty stadiums, which wasn't good for us as a stadium business either. But the conversations we kept going through was, well, maybe it's time for us to try to buy the team. It would make sense. He was insistent on getting a certain dollar amount for the team that didn't make any sense to us based on projected cash flows. But then an event happened that really was a setback to us. At the time, I mentioned that some teams would leave their home communities and move elsewhere because there'd be a lucrative new stadium, proposed by the new community, and it would drag that team to that new location for the financial benefits that the team would receive. One of those teams was the St. Louis Cardinals. The St. Louis Cardinals had relocated to Arizona with a beautiful new stadium, promised to them as a byproduct, and the Cardinals ownership was looking at this as, well, it doesn't make sense for us to stay in St. Louis. The dilemma for St. Louis was St. Louis had the largest NFL sponsor business in its citizenry. St. Louis was home to Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch, the largest, both television and even stadium signage sponsor around the NFL. So Anheuser-Busch isn't thrilled that no longer will its hometown have an NFL presence. And one of the largest shareholders of Anheuser-Busch happened to be a gentleman by the name of James Bush Orthwein. And he was a billionaire. And he decided he'd pay Victor Kiam the king's ransom, what he was looking for, in order to have a team, and likely try to move that then to St. Louis. So there we were. We got news that all our creative work, or all the creative work that Robert Kraft had conducted to position himself to be able to buy the team, got thwarted by this move of a franchise to Arizona, and ultimately a very rich beer guy coming in and paying over $100 million for the team. The issue there was, for the next 2 years, we were fighting in the courts of public policy and editorial boards within the Boston and greater Massachusetts kind of community around all the plans that Orthwein had to do this relocation. Certainly to try to break the lease with Foxborough, and we were just doing everything we could on a legal basis to stop that. Roughly 2 years of that activity paid off for us because Orthwein decided maybe the best strategy or the easiest way to proceed for St. Louis to get a team was to pivot towards seeking an expansion franchise through the NFL, as opposed to trying to do it in the way that he had been posturing to move the Patriots there. So he instructed Goldman Sachs to go ahead and find a buyer for the team. His only kind of constraint to Goldman, though, was you can sell it to anybody but Bob Kraft. The 2 years that we had spent thwarting his dream or plan of moving the team to St. Louis basically left him with a very sour taste in his mouth, and so he wanted to make sure he thwarted our dream as well. And it was roughly 6 more months before all sorts of high-profile prospective buyers did their tire kicking, were led into the data room for due diligence, and all basically coming to the same conclusion that this operating covenant was in fact a deal breaker for them. So Kraft's idea of how important that was going to be, was standing the test of time. And Goldman Sachs finally did convince Orthwein that no, he needed to reconsider the Kraft move, but they promised that he could get even with the Krafts in a different way by making sure that they paid top dollar for the team. And in fact, by the time the process had played out, Kraft decided that he would pay the most money ever paid for a professional franchise. We were balking, 2 years earlier at $100 million purchase price. And by the time we finished with Orthwine, Kraft had basically committed over $170 million.
And I imagine, by the way, now that price is probably looking pretty good nonetheless.
Well, I would guesstimate it's probably valued at about 20 times that now. It's, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion. Yeah, so it turns out that, and that wasn't, a passive investment on Kraft's part. Obviously, he and Jonathan, had a lot to do with, the value appreciation that the Patriots have seen over the years. But it is, I think that was always his, dream, or that was his vision, that, they might be able to introduce things to both the team and at the league level that would ultimately, create more value for everyone.
Yeah, Andy, we could talk for hours about the team and the Patriots, but I'm a Jets fan, so I'm going to try to avoid a lot of the team's success here. It's come at the cost of the team that I root for. But in all honesty, it's an incredible story what you and the Crafts had done with that team and that organization to bring it there. I do want to ask you before
sorry to interrupt you, John. Have you sought any medical intervention for that condition of being a Jets fan? I can't imagine that, they must have some kind of either, psychological, mechanisms, whether it's medicine or something to help you with that addiction.
The problem is the other places that I've lived over the years have been Atlanta and have been Cleveland. And so between those three places, not any of those teams, although certainly Atlanta came the closest, but none of those places have had particular success. So I haven't even been able to become a bandwagon fan of another team in the area where I live. But so there's been some suffering over the years. But I do want to ask you, how your athletic career at Case Western Reserve, how that's helped to impact your career going forward, what lessons you were able to take from that, into your professional career?
It's funny, when things play out when you're in college, you're not really, all that aware of kind of the lesson or the kind of the nature of what you're learning and how that might apply to you later in life. But I certainly think some of the pivots that we talked about at the very beginning, where oftentimes in life you have certain doors that close and other doors that open. And, for me in athletics, it was something that I was still very passionate about, even though I might not have been the most elite athlete to kind of step onto a Division III field. I still enjoyed competition quite a bit. And the idea when I was playing on the soccer team and recognizing that, there just is clearly a skill level amongst my teammates that, is, far beyond what I can, try to develop for myself. So I was kind of seeing that as a closing door, but lo and behold, in this intramural dynamic and having a fraternity brother that was willing to teach me a little bit about the mechanics of throwing a javelin, an unexpected opportunity all of a sudden comes along, and, there's positive reinforcement with, seeing how quickly the learning curve developed for me there. And it wasn't, a pure natural kind of ability, because I spent, every one of those off seasons in the winter, in the snow, kind of just outside of Delbert Gym and kind of, working, on the technique. We had an area set up in one of the gyms with a net in addition to javelin outside and, maybe 25-degree weather, which wasn't all that comfortable, trying to kind of, hone certain kinds of aspects of the technique. There was something called a stubby, which was a stick, maybe, metal stick, maybe 3 feet long with the grip of a javelin. It was weighted to be roughly twice the weight of a normal javelin. And, using that to, again, working, many, many hours to try to kind of develop that kind of expertise. So, you learn both hard work, you learn, the kind of the nature of when there are opportunities, how to seize them. And I think that it was a wonderful metaphor for me, if you will, for kind of the professional, kind of opportunities that I found. They weren't always by design or by plan, but when you hit them, you kind of blink a few times, and then you embrace them, and then you work really hard to try to make sure that the potential can be realized.
Yeah. Last question, and then I'll let you go here. But I do want to ask you, because we get a ton of kids, who are athletes, student athletes, who love the sport, love what they're doing, and want to try to find a way to translate that into a professional career in athletics. And most of the time, and you mentioned it, they're student athletes who, just by nature of being a Division III athlete, probably aren't going to go pro in their sport, but still want to stay involved. What's your advice to those, those student athletes who want to find a way into the athletic industry, on the professional side of it?
It's my response generally, because I get this question all the time, and whether it's for my Harvard MBAs, now that I'm teaching there, or it is, working with Gary Pillar and some of his students that are going through, kind of a sports management, kind of course. One of the things that is very clear is that it's the number of jobs that are available in professional sports, maybe 0.001% of the interest in those jobs. In other words, there's 10,000 people that would love to kind of take a position with a sports franchise or with a league. And so my recommendation isn't necessarily to kind of douse cold water on the dream, but my recommendation is to think about, within the sports world, what is it that you're interested in? Are you interested on the marketing side, the sponsorship side? Are you looking at, kind of developing, some aspect of the media interest, or how media is actually approaching the sport? Are you interested in running a facility, or maybe it's the hospitality side, food and beverage that goes along with those things? Maybe it is because of a technical knowledge of the sport that you hope to be a professional scout or something along those lines. My general view is that you want to be open-minded enough around those functional areas, and see if you can develop your skills outside of professional sports, but in the same kind of domain. So if you want to run a stadium someday, look at the kinds of facilities that are not dissimilar from stadiums. Maybe you become, somebody that is, becoming more and more adept at, developing preventive maintenance schedules for, a normal, kind of real estate complex. And as you learn how to deal with all the different problems and vendors and contractors around HVAC issues or around other, kind of supportive dynamics, at some point in time, your expertise is now transferable, if you will, to, a different domain, and maybe it's a sports facility. It's a metaphor. I would suggest, you could identify a similar kind of path for almost any interest area in sports, but all of those things do well then to kind of both qualify you to get into sports, but it also gives you a very good fallback career if that opportunity in some kind of sports team, sports league environment never materializes. You've still invested in something that's been quite compelling and can lead to a very fulfilling career. I always worry about folks that say, I don't care what I do, I just want to be with the team and I just want to be around it. And they might spend 2-3 years as an intern, but really hadn't developed any new skills or anything else. And then they realize that, what I've done here isn't transferable to something else. So I'm a big fan of, thinking about where can I, where as individuals can we learn the most and create the most value, and then look for the opportunities to shift laterally into the sports realm.
Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's fascinating, some of the stories. Like I said, we could talk about it for hours, I'm sure, but but I'm sure you have other things to do as well here. But we really appreciate it again. It's fascinating to hear what you've done with your life after leaving the school. It's great stuff.
Well, thank you, John. Good to be with you, and good luck with the rest of these, kind of great, all the different folks that I know that you're interviewing have fascinating stories. So I love hearing about all of them.
Great. Well, thank you again, and best of luck.
Thanks.